Yeah, a couple of times. I think one of the biggest ones that we'll find in our career as you get deeper into your career, you often will come into a paper that's on your desk for review that you know who the authors are, or you've seen the paper before somewhere, or some version of the paper. Um, Typically, the way I handle this is I immediately go to the editor and I say, look, I need to disclose there's a conflict. I either know the authors or I've read this paper before somewhere, and I'm not sure if that has implications. One of the instances, I actually had an editor come back to me and say she'd had a really hard time finding somebody to review for this, and if I'm still comfortable with it, that she would prefer that I continue on as long as I can tell her I can be objective. And I did that review, and part of it was that I really felt like I could be objective about it because that's part of our job. But I think that this comes up quite a bit, actually, in the review process. Useful and necessary, I think, are two different standards. I think in terms of usefulness, as someone who actually works with data, would be really easy for me to double check things and to say, your table looks like this. I think I found an error, and when I ran it, I found this competing outcome over here. As a reviewer, it also creates more work for you in some ways because now I have to run data. So in some ways, there's this question about whether or not we should be hand-holding this much, or whether this is really the job of the authors to convince us about it, and we should really just have a few high points that we're trying to say are other people interested in reading this, or should this not be read, and for what critical reasons. So I think they're probably a serious problem. So especially duplicate, if you're sending it to a large journal that has multiple action editors, it would be pretty easy to duplicate. And it depends on how their system is done and whether or not you're changing your title and being kind of coercive. So you can resubmit to a journal, but you have to ask permission ahead of time. And you put that in your cover letter. We've submitted before. Here's the call number for that. We've changed something substantially, or there's a special issue and we think that our paper is a good fit. Can we resubmit? And as long as the journal says yes, then it's okay. The issue is when you do it without asking. For the redundant, and so this is sending it to two different journals at the same time. This is a big no-no. We always do our submissions sequentially, so we wait for a rejection before we send it to the next, or we withdraw a paper before we go to the next journal. And part of this is that we have a relationship with the editor and the reviewers. They're spending a lot of time on this, and it's only fair that we're not using twice as many resources at the same time. So if it's going to make it at one journal or not, we should allow that process to go through before we go to the next one. So this is interesting because a lot of people will change their papers substantially before they go to the next thing. So technically, a lot of people would say it's not the same paper. The other thing is that I think authors, especially more senior authors that I know of, would never disclose this because they will say that this kind of taints the process. You're telling your editor before they've even sent it out for review that this has already been rejected at least once and maybe multiple times before it came to their journal. So it could create some social problems as well among the co-author team, but also in editors. There are some ethical issues that evolve over time in our field, and one of those is working from the same data set repeatedly. So in psychology, you always have to disclose exactly what variables you're using and how they overlap with prior research if it's from the same data set. This is just emerging in the strategy field. And we had a recent paper bumped from a journal because we said, we're using a data set that's also been used in other pubs before. Here's the other pub. But we didn't tell them how it overlapped. And they said, we really needed to know how it overlapped. And so you can't submit to this paper to the journal. So we went to the next place. But in the cover letter now, we have a grid that says what variables we're using and how they're overlapping. And I think that this is something that all journals are going to start adopting in our field over time. And it makes sense because you want to make sure that people aren't just carving up the same data and submitting it to journals over and over again. So in general, if you ever have a question about what's right and wrong before you submit a paper through the process, always contact an editor or the journal if you're in question about it. You can always ask for guidance on this, and always ask it before you do a submission, not after.